The bandwidth for this episode of the AR-15 podcast is sponsored by the Firearms Radio Network. Firearmsradio.tv.
Welcome to the AR-15 podcast. This is the podcast about your favorite black rifle. This show is for you. Whether you're building your first AR or you've been building ARs for years, there is something we can all do to take our black rifle to the next level.
You make this show possible by clicking through our Brownells and Amazon affiliate links. The next time you order online, go to AR15podcast.com and click through our Brownells and Amazon affiliate links. It doesn't cost you anything extra, and a small portion of your sale goes to supporting pro-gun radio like the AR-15 podcast. Support the Firearms Network as a whole by pledging your support at patreon.com/FRN.
Well, hi there, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. It's number 128. We're going to finish up our last thoughts on our six-part series about building an AR-15. So, JW, you and I talked last week about going over some basic zeroing and a rifle function test. So,
right.
Before we get into the main topic, I want to let you all know that Brownells, once again, in the spirit of our series, has given us some Magpul products and a BCM product to kind of go over some of the components in terms of furniture that are currently available on the market, and I think really kind of driving the trends in where the market's going. So I think my next episode we'll be able to get our heads around all of the gear they've sent out and really be able to kind of sit down and talk with you about what these new offerings are putting on the table for you that is new and different from what we're all used to. So stay tuned for that. JW, how's your week been?
Oh, it's been great. I snuck out to a class over in Alliance, Ohio at the police training range this weekend that Sentinel Concepts put on. And it was a home defense long gun course. So everybody was running ARs. We had one SCAR user, but it was a whole bunch of AR variants. And it was a very practical look at fighting with a long gun in your house. So it wasn't like we had 10 mags on and a handgun that we could transition to. It was just long gun with a mag in the gun, and how you can kind of walk around your house looking for work. So it was pretty cool. I got a bunch of great photos. I'll put up a couple of them and a couple clips from guys talking about their rigs and about the class. So I'll get something put together here and put it up on our YouTube page.
Well, that sounds awesome. Well, why don't we dive right into the main topic then and talk about function testing and zeroing your newly built AR. So we've got 5 weeks under our belts talking about putting together an AR and getting yourself to the point where you can actually figure out whether the darn thing is going to work and actually getting it to the range to get it sighted in so you know where it's going to hit. JW, what are your basic thoughts about function testing?
Well, I haven't done the full complete from bare parts all the way to finished rifle build before. I've kind of went with the finished complete uppers for the most part, maybe made a few changes, but I haven't done kind of all the torquing of the barrel and head spacing and all of that before. So I think that's something that's a little foreign to me that I'd probably get some help on. So I'm going to defer that sort of realm to you, because I know that we're dealing with explosive energy here, and so it's something that the AR platform makes easy for us to get into, but I think there's probably going to be some things that we want to double check before we just get blasting away at the range.
Well, You know, I think that you can probably break it down into some pretty fundamental areas in terms of your lower receiver. And then, of course, head spacing is something that, I think that's one of those everybody has an opinion arenas. And so we'll kind of touch on that briefly. But, number one, when I get a rifle built, I've got a rifle here that I'm showing our video. This is a rifle that I have in my collection. One of the first things that I suggest in a function check is that you're going to throw a magazine in here. And you're going to depress your mag release, and you're going to make sure that the mag's going to drop. I have actually, pardon me, I've actually had different lowers react differently to the multiple variations on magazines that are available. I've got one lower that, for the life of me, will not use anything older than a third generation PMAG, but it loves the aluminum or steel mags. So I don't know what it is. I haven't really invested a great deal of effort into it, but I do know if I stick a older PMAG in it, it's not going to drop freely. So that's the first function test. The next function test is basically with your upper receiver mated, you're going to try to make sure that a seated magazine is going to throw your bolt catch up and lock your bolt back. So you'll insert the mag, use your charging handle to draw the bolt all the way back, and hopefully it will catch on the mag release. On the bolt catch. Then returning the charging handle back to its resting position, you're going to tap on your bolt catch, let that bolt drive home. So in doing that, you're going to make sure that it's going to cycle through its hold open function and bolt release functions in an appropriate manner. If you feel or find any resistance in that those two parts of the cycle, you're going to want to go in there and kind of evaluate and troubleshoot what that problem is. The bolt should hold back pretty freely, and when you drop it, it should basically slam home without any resistance whatsoever. I will tell you that I have had a gas tube misaligned just enough for the gas key on the bolt to catch, and it certainly does keep that from slamming home. So these are the kinds of things that you want to make sure you're well aware of before you get to a range, so that you don't have a problem or a wasted day, much less a trip to an emergency room. That's never fun. Trigger function is kind of a different series of evaluations, and I'm going to try to do this without hitting the microphone. But first and foremost, you're going to take your rifle and you're going to take it off of safe, and you're going to put a finger or digit or something just very carefully placed in front of the trigger, and you're going to, in front of the hammer, and you're going to pull the trigger. Now, the hammer is going to go ahead and fall forward, and you're going to want to bring the hammer back. As you bring the hammer back, you want to let the trigger forward just long enough for it to reset. And there's a disconnector which will release from the hammer, and it should fall on its sear. Now, at that point, if that hammer falls freely and your finger catches it, you've got something wrong inside of your trigger assembly, and it's time to pull it apart and diagnose it. Now, at this point, you should be able to pull your trigger again, and it will fall forward and repeat to get that trigger reset by putting your your hammer all the way back as if the bolt had driven it into its cocked position again. Now we let go of our trigger just enough to see it reset. As long as your hammer doesn't fall all the way forward, you should be fine. Now, with the hammer in its cocked position, go ahead and put your rifle on safe. You want to kind of apply some vigorous force to your trigger and see if you're going to be able to overpower your safety. As long as your trigger doesn't fall forward, at this point, you should be fine. Your trigger's going to come back with the bolt carrier group. It's going to set. Your trigger pull will let it fall, and your reset is not going to cause that trigger to disengage from the disconnect past that sear. So, from my perspective on a single action, you've essentially worked the rifle through all of its functions. Now, if you are fortunate enough to have something that is fully automatic or possessed of a 3-round burst, there are some additional parts of that function test that you're going to want to do, but I believe that those are things that are best reserved for another time, since, well, frankly, I'm not going to be able to afford one until the kids are out of college, so I'm not going to worry about it for you. So JW, what's your thoughts about head spacing? Tell me, what have you heard? What have you read?
I guess I've heard that the chamber and the bolt lock up at a certain distance and interface sort of range, and that sometimes they're made to match and sometimes they're all quote unquote mil spec, and so they're just good to go, and there's a range of tolerance that will be okay. Otherwise you could have detonation when the gun's out of battery, or not quite locked up where it needs to be, and just kind of throwing parts together without checking things could get you in trouble somewhere. But that's just kind of a not very informed opinion, or what I had in my head that kind of scared me off of it without knowing or having the tools to do that checking.
So here's kind of the way that it seems to play out. The manufacturers of the rifled barrels have gotten to a point where they are utilizing a pretty standardized set of tools to get to the appropriate chamber depth and all the other dimensions that are of relevance. The barrel extension, which is the component that has the, the starred chamber lugs that your bolt is going to engage with, is something that is designed to a very specific set of dimensions as well. So the theory is, when the two are mated up, barrels should be interchangeable in their completed form in any upper for any AR-15. Now, the industry, as big as it is, it's always possible you've got somebody out there that's putting stuff together that's not within that tight specification. In my experience, the primary drivers of the market, the bigger companies that are putting the products out there, are staying kind of within those guidelines, and I have not heard anything to indicate that they're producing inferior products. But that being the case, the theory is that you shouldn't need to headspace any of your rifles, because that work has been done in the factory.
So when the extension is mated up to the barrel, that's where that adjustment could have been made.
Right. A final reamer. They've done a chamber test. Of course, the bolts are, by and large, even accounting for different manufacturers and different potential wear on the manufacturing equipment, I don't know that there is much likelihood you're going to get a bolt from one to the other that is so different that you will have a situation where your chamber is now unsafe or your rifle's unsafe because the bolt's not engaging. So, I would discount that by and large, unless you're, buying in mass quantities from a large foreign country that makes, predominant number of whoopee cushions and plastic lead painted toys. But, I don't think that that's really where all those parts are coming from. So we should all rest easy. In any case, when it comes down to it, I think that just given what we know about the manufacturing process, when it comes to bolts and barrels, there isn't a lot of need in the eyes of many people to check the headspace on your rifle. But why don't we just go ahead and talk about it so that you have an understanding? What you have are a set of 3 gauges, a go gauge, a no-go, and a field gauge. So the idea is that these gauges run the gamut from the perfect spec to completely out of spec to just in spec enough to let you go. When you're going to use these gauges, you're essentially going to insert them into the chamber and close the bolt behind them. But in doing so, we have to prepare the bolt so that we can get an accurate test. And basically, the thing that you have to do is remove the plunger, the ejection plunger. And you'll have to forgive me. I don't know exactly what that part's called. Maybe JW can look it up for me. But it's essentially just a little piece of steel on the face of your bolt with the spring behind it that's set in place with a roll pin. Now, there's a very particular device sold by Brownells, and it will help you disassemble your bolt without that spring and pin shooting across the room, never to be seen again. So once you've removed that pin from the face of your bolt, you essentially put your gauge into the chamber. And you should start with a go gauge. And what you want to be able to do is press the bolt carrier group home in the upper receiver, and the bolt should easily go into the chamber and rotate into a closed locked position. There should be no resistance whatsoever. So then you want to put in the no-go gauge. And with the no-go gauge in there, in the same manner that you would be manually closing the bolt, not with any force, but just gently pushing the bolt forward and allowing the bolt to try to engage, you will see with a no-go gauge, it shouldn't close. If your bolt carrier group closes behind the no-go gauge, what that means is the depth of your chamber is too far. And if it's too far, then that means you're going to have a failure of your pen to strike your primer from time to time because your cartridge can be resting too far in the chamber and not be close enough. Now, conversely, if you had put the go gauge in and it had not closed, that means your chamber's too short. And just as JW had mentioned, if your rifle had come forward, not gone into battery, and the firing pin had been able to strike the cartridge, at this point, your rifle is going to have a kaboom. You're going to have a catastrophic failure because your bolt's not engaged and you just detonated around in the chamber. Now, whether or not this is possible, really that's a matter for debate. But, ultimately, for the sake of argument, if that is what happens, you're going to have a problem. Now, the field gauge is, frankly, it's a gauge that I don't understand why they have it. It is the gauge that tells you that you are at the sloppiest measure of your bolt's lifespan, yet you're still able to use your rifle.
Okay.
So, perhaps it's a field expedient way of throwing one gauge in the rifle in the field and saying, okay, you're good, you're not. But if you get your gauges and you test your rifles when you got them built, you should have about as much reassurance that you're going to have no chamber problems as you can possibly have without a gunsmith actually performing the exact same test on your behalf. But to be honest with you, every rifle I've built, I've not headspaced it. And there was a time I had a few of them taken to the gunsmith. He did a thorough check, which included headspacing. He said they were fine. Everything was good. So that experience has basically eased my mind. And of course, I'm not through with my black rifle disease, so I may find myself at some future date being a little more concerned about it. But I would say by and large, as long as you're buying components from a quality manufacturer or you're being reassured about their characteristics from a quality distributor or retailer, I would not worry enormously about your headspace.
Yeah, I think if you're walking around the gun show and just kind of getting a no-name upper that's built by somebody who doesn't really have a business card that he wants to leave you with or anything like that, maybe be careful. If you're going to be doing something like that, then maybe get yourself a set of go and no-go gauges to drop in those guns right there at the gun show. But otherwise, it seems like reputable manufacturers know what they're doing and are going to be installing those barrels the right way.
Yeah, and I would bet that in those reputable manufacturers, they're gonna probably check the headspace on the rifles, because that's how they ensure that rifle after rifle, when they're counting up to hundreds of thousands or millions of products rolling off a line, that they don't have a problem for that one that just, for whatever reason, didn't meet the spec. But I don't think that that is an indictment against the platform or their standards or their ability to manufacture them. I think it's just a part of the process. So take that for what it is. And obviously it's about your comfort level. The no-go gauges are not enormously expensive, but certainly they're going to add to the bottom line. Certainly if you have a good gunsmith in your city, your town, wherever it is you're located, certainly taking your rifle to a gunsmith is going to be a way to do the same thing, probably for a lot less. I would imagine your gunsmith's not going to charge you all that much to check the headspace on them. So I think with that, when it comes to the function of your rifle, I think you've covered all the bases. Really, the next only real way to check your rifle's function is to put rounds through it. And of course, if this is your first build, you might be tying a shoestring to the trigger and standing off just a wee bit. But I don't know. I've gotten to the point where I don't do that with every rifle I build. So let's talk about the next really important part of getting your rifle ready for the range, and that's zeroing. So JW, what backup iron sights do you use on your rifles?
I don't know. I think I got one sitting here. I still need to clean everything from the weekend. My SBR has, what are these? Troy, Trigicon, something or others. They're like a flip up, and they got tritium, a couple dots of tritium on them.
Very nice. So JW and I were talking, and JW, what's your preference for a zeroing methodology?
For most of my ARs, I'm not really stretching them out that far. And so having a good zero that will cover most of the operational kind of range is my priority. If it was something that I'm shooting bullseyes with, or something like my bolt guns, you set it to one common zero, like 100 meters, and if you're shooting further than that, you dial it in, or you have dots to compensate, or things like that. With an AR that's used for shorter ranges, typically you'll just have a red dot, maybe an EOTech reticle, and something like just a red dot. You're not going to be able to compensate for different shots, so you want to be able to put the dot either on the target or offset it just by some estimation of the eye, and be able to put the rounds where you want them. And so doing like a 25 or 50 meter zero makes more sense to me, because the bullet's path from 0 to maybe 300 meters is pretty regular. So it's moving up, and then it hits whatever your zero distance is. If it's 25 or 50, it hits 0 there. It crests somewhere around 100, and then it drops back down and zeros again at 200 or 300. And within that range, it's only a couple inches difference. So anything where you're going to be able to see somebody or some sort of target, and be able to put the dot on the target, the rounds are probably going to hit. If you're getting into something like 100-yard zero, I think there's some issues with that, because anything on this side of 100 is going to be hitting low, and anything outside of it's going to be hitting low. There's really just one sweet spot, and after 100, that bullet really starts to drop pretty quick. Whereas with the other zeros, you got a little further before the bullet drops off. Talking through it, it's tough to explain, obviously, on an audio podcast. There's some good diagrams that'll show you the kind of the rainbow shape that the rounds take, and comparing different zeros. But something a little closer, like a 25 or a 50, makes more sense to me for something without magnification, or without a reticle that calls for a certain zero. If you're going to have an ACOG or something like that with a specific zeroing system that might have hashes and numbers that are approximated for certain loads shot through a certain barrel length, go with their recommendations so it's accurate. But if it's just a red dot, then I say zeroed a little bit closer.
I think for me, the biggest issue about the zero is based on the bullet that you're going to use. I have a preference on mine. I'm going to choose the trajectory that's going to have the smallest kind of, how should I say this? The smallest deviation from my point of aim and my point of impact, in terms of how much travel above that point I'm going to get. So I'm trying to reflect back. I think that with the 36-yard zero, or 39-yard, depending on whether it's meters or whatever, somewhere in that range, you're looking at a 300-yard point of impact. And across that trajectory, the bullet is going to travel 9 inches high at its height and fall back to your zero spot. And remember that from your point of aim, you're below the zero. You're going to fire the projectile up past zero through its height of its parabola, just trajectory, and then back down to 0. So in doing that, I can be rest assured that between me and somebody 300 yards out, there is only about 1 dinner plate's difference between the bottom and the top of my bullet's flight path. Now, the difficulty with the shorter trajectories, the shorter zeros, if you're going to have it 0 to 200 or 0 to 100, is that by the time it gets to that target, much past it, it's going to be dropping extremely rapidly. And you're not going to be able to get out to 300, 250, 2.25. I mean, on a 100-yard zero, getting out to 150 or 175 would be impossible without some holdover. So that's my thought process. And when I think about that in terms of the near term, the near distance from 0 to 100, I'm still well below that 9-inch maximum height on my trajectory. So theoretically, I should be able to get any round within a much smaller dinner plate between myself and 100. Now, understand that we're not talking about, aiming with pinpoint accuracy and knowing that I'm going to put my reticle here or my sight post here and it's going to hit right where I say it's going to hit. We're talking about understanding that there's a cone of accuracy. And if that is, a 5-inch dinner plate or a 9-inch dinner plate, I think that most times suitably covers whatever your target's going to be. So for me, that's kind of the starting point that I go through when I'm looking at zeroing a rifle. I do think that there are times that we get on a rifle and we know that the only thing that this rifle is ever going to do is shoot at this range or shoot in these conditions. And given that, I don't think it's really necessary to make it zero it to all conditions or all eventualities. So, there's a finite point where, the 1-0 to rule them all just kind of becomes meaningless. So I think when that overall decision about how you're going to do it comes before you, you have to think about what you're going to use your rifle for. JW trains a great deal, but JW, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't most of the training you undertake focused on urban settings?
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with sight offset at most of the contact distances. Your rounds really don't have much time to rise up to their peak that they hit right around 100 meters. If you're shooting between 5 and 20 meters, it's the distance between your muzzle and your sight is where your round's going to be hitting. So if I want to hit a target between the eyes, I got to put my red dot up on the forehead. And that's something that's tough to remember sometimes when you're running around and pulling shots real quick.
But you should be aiming for the eyes so you hit the medulla oblongata. Isn't that what they teach you nowadays?
It's kind of like a triangular area. So like tip of the nose to the eyes.
I know it's a triangular area that goes from
Down
your
to the
nose to
teeth.
bottom of your chin.
No, not down there.
Right through there, the bullet travels out the back of the base of the spine. And then they just drop. I'm just a little anatomy lesson. Anyways. So, I mean, in JW's case, it doesn't make sense for him to try to figure out how to have a rifle that'll shoot 300 yards. And, I don't need it, but I was trained differently. And, the training that they gave me when I was behind the rifle was, we're training for distance. We're training to be able to take a shot at 200 or 300 yards because, we're fighting in open plains in Europe, and we're storming the Russians, and well, I mean, that all changed rather quickly with the wall coming down and all that. So, and, my entire background in the military became obsolete in one afternoon. So, but still, when it comes down to it, I do think that you have to give yourself a really critical look and say, I don't need to have every rifle. I just need to have a rifle that does what I want it to do. What is that? So take that in under advisement when it comes time for you to get your rifle to the range. And you know what? I don't think it's a problem to have it zeroed at 100 yards, because you're going to be within 0 and 100 yards, able to hit pretty much everything you're aiming at in that urban environment. And that would include, I think, probably your home. And I think a lot of the listeners are probably concerned about those kinds of scenarios than they are trying to reach out and, kill a communist at 350 yards because Sergeant Major said to.
One kind of topic that's related to this, we talked about torquing up certain things on the gun, making sure everything functions right. When you throw that optic on it, make sure it's clamped down tight, whether it's screws or quick releases or whatever. The best way to mount something like that is put it on loose, and then as you're maybe shouldering the gun, push the optic forward in the Picatinny rails before you latch it down or before you tighten it up, so that the recoil of the gun is not going to let that scope move in between the slop and the Picatinny. So you want it butted up against the front. So you make sure it's pushed forward, you clamp it down real tight, make sure it's torqued to whatever it needs to be torqued to. If there's rings, doing the whole tightening pattern just like you would the lugs on a tire. Those sorts of issues I've seen throw guys off. They're trying to zero a new gun and something's just completely loose, and they didn't even check it. Maybe they were real excited to get to the range and they threw it right on the gun and didn't check it. Or maybe they've been shooting it for the first time, and over the course of that first range session, things have gotten loose. Maybe it's the sort of screw that could use some Loctite. And so if you're having issues like that when you're starting to zero and you're practicing the fundamentals of marksmanship properly, but things just aren't quite working out, make sure everything's torqued down and things are tight, because that's so frustrating at the range.
I had a good friend got himself a 30-06 bolt gun. And he had that very problem, and he didn't realize it until after the second range trip.
And 30-06 isn't cheap to just burn away.
No. And it is amazing how very little it takes in terms of something just not being quite right for the whole process of zeroing a rifle to become an absolutely frustrating time. So it's something that you should undertake knowing that you have to be paying attention to the small things. Is everything tightened down? Is everything working the way it's supposed to be working? When you troubleshoot it, you have to always account for you, the shooter. But when that's accounted for and it still won't zero, you should be comfortable with the idea of going component to component and making sure your rifle is doing what it needs to do. Now, I've had a rail that was just off center enough to throw zeroing completely out the window. Because as you would raise or lower the front sight post, you would raise it and it would go up and to the right because it was canted just a little right. And when you would go down, it would go down and to the left. And of course, you're trying to get your windage adjusted for, and if it's gone up and to the right, your windage must now change as well to account for where it should be hitting. So sometimes it makes sense to just sit back and do a very, very thorough investigation of how everything's lining up, what all's going on, is everything cycling or functioning the way it should be, and I think it really is truly amazing how accurate the idea of eyeballing something is, because you can get a sense that it's not quite right if you just line up your eye to something and start trying to look for the parts to be true, the components to be square. I think that a lot of people are really good at that.
And that's actually how I start zeroing a rifle is I pull the upper off, pull the bolt carry group out, and I throw it on a sandbag or something that's a little bit adjustable but pretty solid, and point it at the target at, say, 25 or 50 yards, whatever I'm going to zero at. I bore sight it just with my eye, run my eye down the rifling and get the target roughly where the barrel's pointing. And then I take a look up through the red dot or the scope and see what sort of rough adjustments I need to make. So that's kind of where I start. I make sure to throw a big old piece of paper up, not a little tiny shoot and see on top of a field of maybe a piece of cardboard that's been hanging at the range for a month and has 50,000 holes in it. I put a big old clean piece of paper up with a single aiming point, or maybe just a blank piece of paper. I shoot at the middle of it and start from there. If things still aren't hitting paper, then I start aiming at the corners of the page to try and figure out a quadrant where I might be off. And if it's still not hitting, then I'll get closer and I'll throw a target up at 15 yards and say, okay, let's get it dialed in here. Make sure it's hitting a little bit low, and then start stretching it out. There's no shame in throwing up paper at 20 yards, 25 yards before stretching it out to 100, because otherwise you could just be wasting ammo. There's no reason to just sling ammo over the berm at 100 when you're not sure where it's going to be hitting. And it's safer to do that too, to get a rough idea where things are hitting up close before you start slinging rounds a little further out.
There are a number of tools that are out there. I don't know how reliable some of them are. I know that you can buy a laser device that'll sit in your chamber. You can adjust it to basically point down your barrel, and you can sight with it, but there's some detractors and some people that say that they're not all that well. I do a JW. I mean, JW, I will mark out 25 yards. I'll set up my rifle in a position where it's not going to move and just not touch it. And I eyeball it through the barrel, and then I eyeball it where my backups or my optic is looking at. And I just kind of try to get them both to match on that very same spot. And then given a close, bore sight, sight zero, you can refine that to distance from wherever you start. That is easy enough to do. But it is kind of hard to start with a rifle that's shooting God only knows where, and to dial it onto the paper where you can figure out what's going on. That's really hard.
Yep.
So once you've figured out what you're going to do to sight it in terms of sighting distance, once you've done your preliminary bore sight, it's time to get busy and zero the rifle. And, getting your equipment set up, there's any number of ways to do that. I think we've talked about it in our zeroing episode, and throughout some of the episodes, we've highlighted some of the tricks. But when it comes to the point where you're actually, trigger on the gun and you're going to begin the process of sighting it in, what I always try to do is make sure that I'm adhering to the fundamentals of marksmanship, that I put just enough rounds downrange to get a trend.
Yeah, I said just flip over to 3-round burst and just fire the 3 all at once. And then you got your group, and you can go from there.
See, I always just go one at a time, but I do shoot in groups of 3. And my objective is to figure out whether or not my rifle is going to consistently hit it in the same spot in a 3-round group. And so I might move from target to target to see if I can maintain the consistency there. And consistency tells me it's the rifle. So at that point, I begin my adjustments. And you should have, based on your optics or based on your backups, a pretty rough idea of how many inches at your point of impact, or how many components of inches you're going to be moving your projectile based on the number of corrections you have on your optic or on your backups, whatever it is you're going to be sighting in. So I think all my loopholes, 1 click is a 1/4 inch at 100 yards. So
yeah, you might also see 1/4 MOA. It's a very, very comparable measurement. It's a hair different than an inch, but it's pretty close there when you're zeroing at 100. When you're seeing marks like that on your optics, if say it says a 1/4 at 100, and you want to zero at 25, you can still do that. You're just going to have to multiply your number of clicks by 4 in that case. So if you're an inch off at 25 and you want a 25 0, then you need to do, so if it's an inch off, it's 1/4 clicks. If it was an inch off at 100, you'd need 4 clicks, but at 25, you're going to need 16 clicks. So
shouldn't we reversed?
No, you're going to need more if it's up close. Think about it.
Yeah, but it gets magnified the further away it is.
So every click you do, say it's a click at 100, if you were to do that same click at 200, then it would move a 1/2 inch. So up close, it moves even less. So you need more clicks.
All right, I'm going to take you on faith.
Okay.
But if you, the listeners, find fault with his mathematics and his engineering background, please write us, because that just seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, just something to keep in mind if you are zeroing at a closer distance is you might just throw a couple clicks in, and you might not be able to see what's happening. You really need to give it quite a few clicks if it's off a substantial amount up close.
All right. So once you've got your rifle zeroed in, what's left to do, JW?
I don't know. Find some steel, because that's a lot more fun than zeroing targets.
I think when it comes down to it, pass the function test, pass the zero, I think you have a rifle that have an opportunity to get familiar with, and you should spend some time getting to know what it can do in varying conditions.
Some of the things that you might run into function-wise when you do start running live ammo through it, issues with your buffer spring, whether the magazine catches the bolt carrier on the last round when the mag's empty, if you're running suppressed or something like that, where it alters the amount of gas, or if you've got an adjustable gas block that you need to figure out what the best setting is to maybe lower recoil, but also keep that bolt hold open once you empty a mag. You can play with things like that. Those are the kind of checks that you really can't do back at home unless you got a cool range.
You've also got issues with bolt bounce. You can have some timing issues. Can have failures to eject, failures to feed. These are things that really, in a broader sense, can usually be traced to some very simple routine things. So, I think it goes back to the idea of just being patient with your rifle. I've had steel cased ammo that was from a manufacturer that I don't think was all that good. And I had one rifle, it just would never cycle in. It would never, it had problems ejecting every single time. And I'd put the same ammo in another rifle and it would just, run like a sewing machine. No problems whatsoever.
Hmm.
But it wasn't the components of the firearm, because you put standard brass ammunition in it, virtually anything else on the market. Everything I tried it in never had a problem, but it was just that one box of steel cased ammo, and that rifle didn't like it. So, obviously, I don't want to go and disassemble the rifle and swap out all the components because I'm having problems with one box of ammo. So, you really have to be a good troubleshooter, and you have to figure out what's the core of the problem and kind of try to zero in on it. And there's a lot of moving parts, and there's some parts that aren't a part of the rifle that can affect it as well. So, when it comes down to it, I don't know, JW, what do you think? Would it just be a function of your standard troubleshooting?
Oh
Try
yeah,
this,
I mean
try that.
there's something to be said for saving some money and building your own. But there's a reason why manufacturers stay in business, and they are able to do things at scale and check everything, and they go through those steps as far as all the R&D involved with choosing the right components, and you might have put together a combination of things that just doesn't really work well together, and
Right.
so sometimes having a manufacturer to be able to call up and say, hey, your gun's not working the way I was hoping it would, and having somebody to bounce those ideas off of, sometimes it's worth a little extra coin. But the AR community is such that even if you do kind of Frankenstein something together, you're going to find somebody out there who's either done something similar or can pick up on the clues that you feed out from your time at the range or fitting things together to give you some feedback and just kind of help you along. Everybody seems more than willing to give their ideas and their opinions on everybody else's build and issues that they might be running into.
Absolutely. But, I think JW brings up a good point. There's a whole community out there. As long as you can bring them some fundamental facts about what's going on, there's no doubt that someone out there is going to have an answer for you. So it really does come down to just being thorough, letting them know what you've tried, what you've done, what your components are. Because, it can be anything from, my bolt's too light, or not my bolt, my buffer's too light, my buffer's too heavy. My bolt carrier is too light, my bolt carrier is too heavy. I have the wrong spring in there. I didn't oil my rifle. I have no lubrication in my rifle. And those are just like, big issues. It could be 1,000 tiny issues from, that particular manufacturer doesn't like that particular manufacturer's bolt or bolt carrier or whatever. And so you need to swap something out. But JW's right. There's a whole community out there available to you. Obviously, you have to be careful when you get on a forum, because the first guy is going to yell at you for having asked the question. The second guy is going to beat up the first guy for yelling at you, and the third guy will be the one that has the answer. So wait for the third guy, and don't be offended.
Yep.
Just kidding. Kind of. Anyways. So, I think that pretty much covers the basics of the last piece. And when it comes down to it, I think the only thing that you have to take away from the entire series is that while there's a lot of stuff out there, don't be intimidated. as much information as we've provided. There are 10 times the kinds of resources available to make sure that you get it done right. And the whole community likes to help. They like to help people get it right and get into it and enjoy themselves while they're doing it. So don't be afraid to dip your big toe into the water and get your first rifle built. JW.
Just send me some parts.
Well, I think I've got some parts headed your way.
Okay. I got a vice grip and some sledgehammers.
Oh, my God. All right. Well, listen, we want to remind you guys that we have an awesome opportunity from Otis Technology. The fine folks at Otis have given us a mountain of rifle maintenance tools and cleaning kits for the AR-15 and AR-10, and we've been tasked with giving them away. So we want to watch for the special post on Facebook, and, well, we've gotten away from Instagram this week or this month, so watch for those special posts on Facebook to get a chance to win some of these awesome products made by Otis Technology. So we'll be giving away a complete MSR cleaning kit in either 556 or 762 in the middle of each month up until Christmas, when we'll give away one complete Otis Technology Elite cleaning system. So during the alternating weeks, we'll be giving away a host of other Otis tools and cleaning supplies like the bone tool and Otis's new Star Chamber cleaning tool. So with that, we want to let Chris Inouye. I'm really not sure how to pronounce that. So Chris you're the winner.
There you
go.
Chris, I think we sent a message out. It may or may not have gotten to him, and he shot us a message right back. I know Anthony did this drawing about 2 hours ago before we pressed record, and Chris shot a message right back. So he is on the page. Sounds like he is a faithful listener, and he reached out, and we're gonna have to send him some Otis gear.
Well, I tell you what, I need to keep up. I thought I was running the show. I think you guys are running me.
This whole social media thing, I mean, you got to get up to speed on this, Reed.
I'm just a day late and $1 short. I don't know what it is. I think I'm still missing the days when I had to get up and change the channel on my 13-inch black and white by clicking a knob. But so we've got some feedback, and why don't I start here with Dan V. So Dan writes in, he says, "Hey guys, I just got a dedicated 22 long rifle upper by Chiappa and put it on my standard Bushmaster lower." He says he took it to the range and ran CCI AR Tactical through it. He says it ran like a dream. Any 22 platform will have a snag or two, but in 300 rounds, he had maybe 3 issues. So that's about 100-to-1 ratio. That's not so bad. So Dan, he says he loved it, and he got some great range time with his AR. And let's see. He said Bud's, and I'm assuming he's talking about Bud's Gun Shop, said had the upper and 2 30-round mags for about $130 on sale. Best money that Dan has spent in a while.
Nice.
Dan, thanks for the plug. Chiappa makes some really awesome looking gear, so a chance to get something in house and see what it looks like.
Yeah, when you're going 22 conversion, I guess there's a couple options. You could do a dedicated build. You could get something from the factory that's just made for 22, and that's all it runs. Maybe real lightweight with a bunch of polymer. You could get a dedicated upper like Dan did, so you'd kind of need a new set of optics or irons for it, but it would just drop right on whatever lower setup you had. You can also get a drop-in bolt that would let you run the upper that you're used to with the same optic. Obviously your zero might shift, and you may have some accuracy issues between the different twist rates between like a dedicated 22 long rifle upper and a 5.56, but it would kind of let you to train on the cheap with the setup that you're used to. So there's some decisions to be made there, but it sounds like you got a great deal here, and I'm
Absolutely.
sure that'll be fun.
Let me ask you, JW, if somebody gave you a upper receiver, basically put together for the 22 long rifle,
Mhm.
and a 30 round mag, which would in essence simulate the same mag capacity that you would have in an AR, would you use that to train? Do you think there would be any difference in terms of its training value for the kind of training that you do?
I think that's like the key part of it is what's the kind of training that you do. If it is marksmanship training, then there's obviously going to be a difference there. If it's something like a shoot house, like I swung by this weekend, that sort of course is set up to be a problem solving course, and you could run the whole weekend without firing a round. You could do it with sticks instead of guns and still learn as much. So I think having a 22 set up for courses like that would be a great way to save some cash. Getting used to the recoil and the noise and the feel of the full power round definitely has some benefit, but I know guys like Pat Rogers are more than happy to have guys run their 22 setups in the range if they want to save some coin.
Well, good point. Well, hey, Dan, thanks for writing in and giving us the lowdown on the Chiappa Upper. And JW, you want to take Ken from Phoenix?
Yeah, Ken says, thanks for getting the links to the old podcasts fixed. Episodes 25 and 13 are the only two that no longer have any active MP3 or YouTube associated with them. So we'll have to take a look at those. He said, in a past episode, you asked if anyone would be interested in purchasing the old episodes, like on a memory stick or something. He said an electronic download would be great because then we wouldn't have to mail them out. He said he would purchase. So he mentioned that we asked about 458 SOCOM versus 450 Bushmaster, and he's a 450 Bushmaster guy. He's got one of those. He gave us a link to the 450bushmaster.net forum that I guess the original designer frequents and answers people's questions. And he says that he chose that one because he got a good deal on it, and he actually has used it to hunt elk before.
This has been a production of the Firearms Radio Network. You can find more information at firearmsradio.tv.